There were 72 airliner crashes in 1972. That works out at roughly 1 every 5 days somewhere in the world for a full year. Some of them took a handful of people, and some took a 170 at once. And the ones in this video happened on 5 continents in the space of 12 months. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. We have covered this crash before, because it turns up wherever people discuss distraction in a cockpit. It belongs here for a different reason, which is that it happened on the 29th of December. Eastern Airlines took delivery of the first Lockheed TriStar in April 1972, and the aircraft flying that night had been on the line 4 months with under 1,000 hours on it. Lockheed's design philosophy was that only the best available technology would go into it, and where that technology did not exist yet, the company would build it. The TriStar was the first airliner able to fly on autopilot from takeoff through touchdown. Flight 401 left New York for Miami at 9:20 in the evening with 163 passengers and 13 crew. Captain Robert Loft was 55 and had close to 30,000 hours behind him, having started flying in the propeller era. First Officer Albert Stockstill was at the controls, with flight engineer Donald Repo at the panel behind them. All 3 pilots were new to the type, with about 300 hours each. On approach to Miami, Loft lowered the landing gear, and the green light for the nose gear stayed dark. He raised the gear and lowered it again, and the light stayed dark. They needed that indication before they could land, so they told the tower they would circle. Approach control put them into a holding pattern at 2,000 feet, west of the airport, out over the Everglades. Repo ran a test that lights every bulb in the cockpit at once, and the nose gear light stayed out, which meant the bulb itself had failed. Loft and Stockstill began working on it, trying to pull the bulb from its socket and reseat it, and it jammed halfway into the hole. Stockstill engaged the autopilot, and all 3 pilots gave the light bulb their full attention. At some point, Loft turned in his seat to tell Repo to climb into the avionics bay and check the gear position through a viewing window, and in turning he pressed on his control column hard enough to disengage the autopilot's altitude hold. The TriStar's autopilot was more complicated than anything before it. A firm push on the yoke would hand pitch control back to the pilots, while the mode selector stayed in the command position, giving no obvious sign that anything had changed. The single indication was one small light going out on the glare shield. The airplane held its height until Stockstill noticed they were slightly fast and eased the power back. With nothing holding the altitude, it began a shallow descent. The flight engineers panel produced a chime to signal that they had left their selected altitude by 250 feet. Repo was down in the avionics bay by then, and nobody in the cockpit registered it. The airplane kept sinking through the dark. Below them, the Everglades lay black from one horizon to the other, the same in every direction. The controller had an altitude readout of 900 feet on his display, but the radar system was new and known to produce false readings that lasted a sweep or two. He asked the crew how things were coming along out there. Loft answered that they would like to turn around and come back in, and the confidence in that reply satisfied the controller, who went back to other traffic. Seconds later, Stockstill glanced at his altimeter and asked whether they had done something to the altitude. Loft looked, saw the numbers running down towards 0, and pulled back. At 12 seconds past 11:42, Flight 401 struck the Everglades at 365 kilometers an hour and disintegrated across several hundred meters of shallow water and sawgrass. The first people to reach it were 2 frog hunters, Bud Marquis and Ray Dickinson, who had watched the aircraft pass low overhead and then seen the fireball. They got there in an airboat and started pulling people out, wading through jet fuel in the dark. Their first priority was anyone hanging upside down in a seat, because the water was only 15 to 30 centimeters deep, and people were drowning in it. A Coast Guard helicopter was airborne within 5 minutes, and its pilot did not believe the report, because a TriStar could not simply fly into flat ground on a clear night. When he arrived over the swamp, he could not find the wreck, so Marquis waved his frogging lamp back and forth until they saw him. 13 kilometers of swamp separated the wreck from the nearest road. It took 64 minutes to get the first survivor out, and the last were still there after 3 in the morning. Rescuers found Loft alive in the cockpit, and he died of his injuries within minutes. Repo came out of the avionics bay alive and died in hospital. The crash killed 101 people and 75 lived, which made it the deadliest single aircraft accident in American history at that point and the first fatal crash of a wide-body airliner anywhere. The safety board found the bulbs had burnt out, and the nose gear had been down and locked the entire time. Its report was the first to name over-reliance on automation as a cause, and the first to identify what the industry would later call crew resource management, though the term did not exist in 1972. Loft never split the tasks up, so all three men worked the same problem while the machine flew itself into the ground. Los Rodeos sits 600 meters above sea level on the north side of Tenerife, in a saddle between two hills, and cloud drifting in off the Atlantic settles into that saddle and stays there. Pilots who flew the Canaries knew the fog. It was a feature of the place, the way turbulence is a feature of flying near mountains. On the 3rd of December 1972, the visibility on the ground was about 150 meters. Flight 275 was a Convair 990 Coronado, waiting to take 148 German passengers home to Munich. Most of them were transport operators from Bavaria, members of an association of bus company owners that had chartered the aircraft for a group holiday in the islands. The airplane itself was 10 years old and had come to Spantax from American Airlines 7 months earlier in May 1972. It had 24,000 hours on it. Captain Daniel Núñez Ronda, a former Spanish Air Force pilot who had flown for Spantax since 1966. Beside him sat First Officer Francisco Javier Saavedra at 36. They took the runway in the dark and released the brakes at 6:45 in the morning. Once the Coronado was rolling, the crew were flying on runway edge lights and instruments alone. It lifted off, climbed to about 100 meters, and then turned right and kept turning. The maneuver was in no departure procedure. Witnesses on the ground described the aircraft going through something close to a full circle, with its engines at full power and its tanks full for a 5-hour flight. It came down about 300 meters past the end of the runway and burned. Rescuers pulled one person out of the wreck alive, and he died before reaching treatment at the hospital in Santa Cruz. The crash killed the other 154 at the site. It was the worst air disaster Spain had ever suffered, and the fourth worst anywhere in the world at that point. The investigation ran into its limits fast. Recorder technology in 1972 was primitive. The cockpit voice recording produced little usable material, and the flight data recorder was damaged beyond much use. Spanish authorities ran the inquiry, and when German investigators traveled to Tenerife, the authorities refused to let them take part. The Canary Islands had an active independence movement at the time, so the first theory was an explosive device. Investigators went through the wreckage and found no blast damage, then examined engine failure and ruled that out early. The finding they reached concerned the captain's inner ear. In darkness, with the runway lights sliding away underneath and a black windscreen ahead, the balance organs can report a turn that is not happening or miss one that is. The condition has a name: somatogyral illusion, and it is dangerous because the sensation is completely convincing. Núñez Ronda had accurate instruments in front of him and a body insisting on something else, and in the seconds he went with the body. The Spanish finding also recorded that the crew had chosen to depart in weather that gave them almost nothing to fly by. 90 minutes before takeoff, Captain Stanley Key had a shouting match in the crew room at Heathrow. British European Airways was in the middle of a bitter internal fight that summer. The younger pilots wanted to strike for better pay and conditions, while the older ones treated flying as a calling rather than a job, and opposed the whole idea. Key was 51, had 15,000 hours, and was one of the loudest anti-strike captains in the company. Someone had been scrawling messages about him on flight engineers' tray tables across the Trident fleet, including one that read that Key must go. That afternoon, another pilot asked him how his campaign against the strike was going, and Key came apart at him. Key had atherosclerosis and was unaware of it, as was everyone around him. The fatty buildup in his arteries had narrowed them significantly, and the spike in blood pressure during that argument tore open a piece of the arterial lining. The injury left his heart working, and gave him pain that would build over the next hour and a half. The crew that joined him in the cockpit was young. Second Officer Jeremy Keekly was 22 and had a couple of dozen hours on the Trident. Second Officer Simon Ticehurst was acting as flight engineer. An off-duty captain rode in the jump seat behind them. Flight 548 lifted off from Heathrow at 8 minutes past 4 on the 18th of June, 1972, with 112 passengers and 6 crew bound for Brussels. Key was flying. He set the autopilot to a speed 7 knots slower than standard, and the airplane climbed out slow. 93 seconds in, he cut the power for the noise abatement procedure that Heathrow required over the London suburbs and retracted the flaps, and the speed dropped to 20 knots below where it should have been. His radio calls in this period were unusually short, missing readbacks and details a captain would normally give. Passing 1,770 feet at 162 knots, Key pulled the droop lever back. The droops are panels along the front of the wing that increase lift at low speed, and retracting them raises the speed at which the wing stalls by about 30 knots. The lever that operates them sits next to the flap lever. Key had almost certainly meant to retract the flaps, forgetting that they had already been retracted a minute earlier. The stall speed jumped above the airplane's actual speed, and the Trident stalled instantly with no warning beforehand because it had been flying comfortably a second earlier. Everything happened at once. The autopilot dropped out, the stick shaker started rattling the control columns, and the stick pusher shoved the nose down to recover. On a normal approach to a stall, the shaker comes first, and the pusher follows several seconds later. Here they arrive together, which is a behavior no airline trained its pilots to expect. The pusher pushed twice more before somebody in that cockpit pulled the override handle and switched it off. The Trident stalled fully and fell out of the sky while all three pilots sat still. It came down almost vertically in a field outside the village of Staines, nose high, missing a set of power lines by a small margin, and broke apart on the grass. A boy watching from the street ran to fetch a neighbor who was a trained nurse, and she was the first person to reach it. Inside the wreckage, she found one man still breathing, unresponsive, and he died in hospital. The crash killed all 118 people aboard, which made it the deadliest on British soil at the time. The investigation had no cockpit voice recorder to work with, because British law did not require one. What it had instead was an autopsy. Pathologists found the tear in Key's artery and dated it to between 1 minute and 2 hours before death, which put it squarely in the crew room. The medical view was that this would have left him conscious and capable, but in enough pain to degrade his flying, which accounts for the low speed and the clipped radio calls, and eventually the wrong lever. That left the question of why the two young men beside him did nothing about any of it. Keeley had watched Key tear into a colleague 90 minutes earlier, knew what had happened to his roommate over the same issue, and had almost no time on the aircraft. Instructors testified that he was slow to react and doubted himself. His view of the droop lever may also have been blocked by his own armrest. Ticehurst was talking to the off-duty captain in the jump seat. The board recommended a mechanical lock to stop the droop lever moving at low speed, along with training on stalls caused by configuration changes and on recognizing subtle incapacitation in a colleague. It also recommended that every British airliner carry a cockpit voice recorder. The board admitted openly that without one, it could not be certain its reading of the crew's actions was correct, and that a recording might have taken the inquiry somewhere else entirely. Britain made them mandatory afterward. East Germans could not travel where they liked. Foreign holidays meant the socialist bloc, and for most people that meant the Black Sea. The resorts at Burgas on the Bulgarian coast were where a family from Berlin went in August if they could get the booking. Flight 450 left Berlin-Schönefeld at 29 minutes past 4 on the afternoon of the 14th of August, 1972, with 148 passengers aboard. 144 were East German, 3 were Austrian, and 1 has never been identified by nationality. 8 crew were with them, 4 in the cockpit and 4 in the cabin. The aircraft was an Ilyushin 62, the first long-range jet Interflug ever operated, delivered new in April 1970 with 3,500 hours on it. Captain Heinz Pfaff was 51 and had about 8,100 hours across 3 Ilyushin types. All of them had trained on the type in Moscow with Aeroflot. At 29,000 feet over the Cottbus region, the crew reported difficulty with the elevator control. Pfaff turned the aircraft around for Berlin. There's a compartment in the tail of an Ilyushin 62 that sits outside the pressure cabin. Hot air ducts run through it, carrying bleed air from the engines to the air conditioning at 300 degrees and under pressure, and electrical cables run through the same space. In 1972, that compartment was sealed off from view and unmonitored, with the crew's only knowledge of it coming through the systems that passed through. One of those ducts had sprung a leak. The escaping air melted the insulation on the cables beside it, which produced short circuits and arcing, and the arcing started a fire in the rear cargo hold. The hold was carrying flammable de-icing fluid, and the fire took hold of it. In the cockpit, all of this registered as a problem with the elevator. They dumped fuel to get the weight down for landing. 3 minutes later, Pfaff began an emergency descent. Cottbus lay closer than Berlin and might have taken them, and he flew past it, most likely because everything he could see told him he had a control problem rather than a fire. At 1 minute to 5, he transmitted a mayday, gave his heading, and said he could not hold altitude. The tail had been burning for about 20 minutes by then. Seconds after that transmission, the structure gave way and the entire tail assembly separated from the fuselage. What was left went into an uncontrolled descent and broke apart in the air. The wreckage came down at 1 minute past 5, 400 to 600 meters east of the edge of Königs Wusterhausen. 12.5 kilometers southeast of the airport it had left 32 minutes earlier. The crash killed everyone aboard. It remains the deadliest aviation accident that has ever happened on German soil, and at the time it was the second deadliest anywhere in the world. The East German Aviation Inspectorate, the Criminal Police, and the Flight Safety Ministry ran the investigation, and Interflug grounded its whole Ilyushin 62 fleet while they worked. They traced the leak through the cables to the arc and the fluid it lit. Ilyushin declined to accept that the design was at fault. Modifications went on to every aircraft of the type in service anyway, adding an inspection window into the compartment and a fire detector inside it, along with regular checks on the air conditioning system. The full explanation stayed inside the system. The aircraft was the Soviet Union's flagship long-range airliner, and East Germany was in no position to say publicly that its design had killed 156 people. The complete account only reached the public after the country that suppressed it stopped existing. In the cemetery at Wildau, there is a memorial that is also a mass grave, holding 60 passengers who were never identified, with their names on the stone. In 2024, the town of Königs Wusterhausen named a street after Heinz Pfaff, on the grounds that the aircraft came down clear of the houses, and that the town owed that to what he did in the last 2 minutes. The 5th of May 1972 was the last day of campaigning before Italy's general election. Sicilians working on the mainland were going home to vote, and Flight 112 out of Rome was full of them. 108 passengers and 7 crew on a Douglas DC-8, the airplane left Rome about 30 minutes late. Captain Roberto Bartoli worked the radio while First Officer Bruno Dini flew. They called Palermo approach at 9:10, 74 miles out. The weather at Punta Raisi was 3 miles of visibility with broken cloud at 1,500 feet, marginal but workable. Instead of following the vectors the controllers gave them, the DC-8 flew on past the airport and descended. Why it did that is the question the last 53 years have been about. At about 23 minutes past 10, it struck a ridge of Montagna Longa at 935 meters between the towns of Cinisi and Carini. The airplane disintegrated, and 40,000 liters of fuel went up across a debris field 4 kilometers long. People in Carini, standing in the square listening to the final campaign speech, saw the fireball on the mountain. All 115 aboard were killed. It is still the deadliest single aircraft accident in Italian history. The transport minister appointed a commission, and it reported in 2 weeks. Its conclusion was that the crew had failed to follow air traffic control instructions and flown into the mountain. A court in Catania confirmed that finding in 1984. What the crew actually did wrong, and why, stayed blank in both documents. The physical evidence was thin to begin with. The flight recorder had failed, and the investigation noted that and moved on. The radar track of the flight exists nowhere because the investigators never requested it. The commission was assembled with 11 members, instead of the 13 the rules required, which excluded 2 pilots from the National Pilots Association. Accusations then appeared in the press that the crew had been drinking, and that Bartoli had been mentally clouded by alcohol or drugs. The head of forensic medicine in Palermo ran the tests and cleared both men. The Pilots Association publicly doubted that men of that experience could have made such an error, and the court judgments themselves note the contradiction between the gravity of the alleged mistake and the professionalism of the pilots who supposedly made it. 3 people did stand trial: the airport director and 2 aviation authority technicians, on the theory that the mistake had been made on the ground. The court acquitted all 3 after a 10-year case. Reuters ran a story 3 days after the crash saying there had been an explosive device on board. Investigators dismissed it. 4 years later, a deputy police commissioner in Trapani named Giuseppe Peri wrote a 36-page dossier and sent it to 8 prosecutors. His argument was that the crash belonged to the strategy of tension, the campaign of political violence running through Italy in those years, and that it involved neo-fascist elements in contact with organized crime. He pointed to the timing on the eve of an election, and to residents of Carini, who said the aircraft was already burning as it passed overhead. Pathologists had also reported that the bodies were disintegrated in a way impact alone does not produce. Perry's theory was that the device had been meant to go off on the ground as a demonstration, and that the flight's delay put it in the air instead. His dossier sat in a drawer until the sister of one of the victims found it. Investigations reopened in 2006 and closed again shortly afterward. The families then commissioned Rosario Ardito Marretta, professor of aerodynamics at the University of Palermo, who published his findings in 2022. Using laboratory work and mathematical modeling unavailable in the 1970s, he concluded that a charge about the size of a cigarette packet, placed in a recess in the wing, would have torn it open and started a fuel-fed fire. He has said publicly that he would not call it a hypothesis, because the probability is higher than what DNA evidence delivers. The court in Catania accepted that the study was scientifically sound and ruled that it amounted to an opinion. Prosecutors declined to reopen, on the grounds that anything they found now would arrive too late to prove. The families asked again in 2023, appealing directly to the President of the Republic, and were refused. There is a metal cross at the top of Montaña Longa with the names on it. Midway was Chicago's original airport, and it sits inside the city, boxed in by streets on all four sides. By 1972, there were houses right up to the fence line, and the approach to runway 31 left crossed several blocks of them at low altitude. Flight 553 was a Boeing 737 running from Washington National to Midway, with 55 passengers and 6 crew, on the afternoon of the 8th of December. 3 pilots were aboard: Captain Wendell Whitehouse, First Officer Walter Coble, and Second Officer Barry Elder. An hour and a half into the flight, a light came on to tell the pilots their flight data recorder had stopped working. Whitehouse told Elder to find out what was wrong with it. Elder hunted for the circuit breaker without success and began pulling breakers to see what happened. When the controller cleared them down to 2,000 feet, Coble read it back, and Whitehouse kept the aircraft at 4,000 for another 35 seconds before starting down. Being late meant being high. The airplane crossed the outer marker at 2,200 feet instead of the recommended 1,500, so he set up a descent rate faster than the approach called for, and to get it, he deployed the speed brakes, the panels that stand up out of the wing to add drag. Only then did he call for the final descent checklist, which should have been finished before the outer marker. The 2 men rushed through it. When Coble reached the speed brake item, he glanced at the indicator light and called them armed. That light reads the same for armed and for fully deployed, and he took it at face value without checking the lever. At 1,000 feet, Whitehouse saw ground through the cloud and leveled off, because 1,000 feet was as low as he could go without seeing the runway, and the speed brakes came with him. The airplane was already below 130 knots. Flying level with those panels standing up, it lost speed fast, and 7 seconds later, the stick shaker fired. Whitehouse, unaware the speed brakes were extended, decided he had too much drag from the flaps and retracted them from 30 degrees to 15. That took away lift and made it worse. A second later, he understood, said he was sorry, put the flaps back to 40, and raised the gear. The drag he had forgotten about canceled all of it, and the 737 stalled at 400 feet. It fell tail first, clipped a tree and a garage, and went into a house on West 70th Place. The fuselage broke in 2 and slid across the street into 3 more, and then the fuel caught. Most of the people forward of the wings died on impact. Almost everyone in economy survived the crash itself and then had to climb out through smoke and darkness, over seats the impact had thrown into the aisles. A great many of them ran out of time on the way to an exit, and the smoke that killed them contained carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide. Whitehouse died the same way. Firefighters had the blaze out about half an hour later and expected no more survivors. Flight attendant Marguerite McCausland had been sitting just behind the cockpit, and the impact threw her partly out of the aircraft and buried her under debris that shielded her from the fire. She heard a firefighter say he did not think anyone in that section was alive, and started screaming until they found her. She recovered completely, the only person forward of the wings to live. The crash killed 43 of the 61 people aboard, along with 2 residents whose house the airplane destroyed. With the flight data recorder dead, the safety board rebuilt the approach from radar returns and the cockpit tape, then ran simulator tests to find what would bleed the speed off that fast. The speed brakes were the only configuration that produced it. The probable cause was the captain's failure to exercise positive flight management, traced back through the rushed checklist and the late descent to the broken recorder that started it. The flight number belonged to a route that crossed most of the world, Tokyo to London, with stops at Hong Kong, Bangkok, New Delhi, Cairo, Rome, and Frankfurt. On the 14th of June 1972, the Douglas DC-8 doing that run was on its 4th leg, 3.5 hours out of Bangkok, coming into Delhi at night. 78 passengers and 11 crew were aboard. One was the Brazilian actress Leila Diniz, 27 years old, and among the most recognizable figures in her country, known for public positions on women and sexuality that Brazil in that decade found difficult. Approach control cleared them for a straight-in landing on runway 28. The first officer was flying. The aircraft reported passing 23 miles out on the distance measuring equipment. About 8 kilometers from the runway, it was above the glide slope with its approach speed 65 knots higher than it should have been, and the flaps already down, and then it began losing height and speed together while the captain watched. The DC-8 struck approach lights and ground equipment about 460 meters short of the threshold, went out of control, lost all 4 engines and slid several hundred meters before stopping in flames on the west bank of the Yamuna River near the village of Jaitpur. The impact spread wreckage across roughly 2 square kilometers of farmland. Radio contact had been normal until 12 minutes past 8 in the evening, when the transmission simply stopped and the crew sent nothing in between. Rescuers and local villagers pulled 14 people alive out of the wreck that night and got them to hospitals in Delhi. 8 of them died on arrival. 5 survived, 4 passengers and 1 crew member who had been riding in the cabin as relief crew. Everyone on the flight deck was killed. 86 people aboard died in total, along with 4 farm laborers working in the fields beside the crash site. Relatives arrived over the following days and identified their dead at the Wellington Hospital mortuary by sight, working from the passenger manifest. Then there is the cockpit voice recording. Right through the approach, the crew sound completely normal, running the configuration calls and reading out altitudes and positions in the ordinary way. The recording holds no moment where any of the 3 men registers that something has gone wrong, and it ends with the aircraft still sounding like a routine arrival. India's Civil Aviation Directorate ran the inquiry as the country where the crash happened, with Japanese participation. Its finding was that the crew had abandoned their instrument indications and continued descending below the glide slope, without ever confirming they could see the runway, and that nobody in the cockpit was cross-checking anybody else. The Japanese Accident Commission reached the opposite conclusion. Its report held that the ground equipment at Palam had transmitted a false glide slope signal, and that the crew had followed it in good faith, because everything else in the cockpit agreed with it. Joint review sessions produced no agreement, and each side published its own report. Indian investigators maintained that the onboard instruments and the radar returns showed a stable approach until the crew deviated from it. Japanese investigators maintained that the signal itself was wrong. The lawsuits that would normally follow an accident like this never materialized. The flight was Japanese, the airspace was Indian, and assigning liability across that line proved impossible. In a Delhi cemetery on Prithviraj Road, there is a black sandstone memorial, maintained by the Japanese embassy. It holds the ashes, and the names and nationalities are cut into the stone. Of the 7 accidents in this video, 2 have never been explained. The Alitalia jet on the Sicilian mountain produced one official finding, a police dossier arguing the opposite, and a court case still being fought 53 years later. The Japanese crew at Delhi were blamed by one country's investigators and cleared by another's, and both reports still stand. 2 out of 7 is roughly what the whole year looked like. A modern accident inquiry starts with 2 boxes that record everything, and in 1972, that was not how it worked. British law left cockpit voice recorders optional, so the Trident that came down at Staines flew without one. Its investigators wrote in their own report that a recording might have sent them somewhere else entirely, and that the questions they were leaving open would stay open. They have. The Alitalia DC-8 had a recorder and it had failed. The investigation noted that and moved on, and the radar track of the flight exists nowhere, because the investigators worked the case without ever asking for it. The Boeing over Chicago had a recorder that quit 14 minutes before impact, so the safety board rebuilt the whole approach from radar returns and from engine noise on the cockpit tape, then flew simulator tests until it found the only configuration that matched. Even the tapes that survived were thin. The Japanese crew at Delhi sound like a normal arrival until the moment the recording ends. The Spanish charter crew at Tenerife left almost nothing usable on theirs, and their flight data recorder came out of the wreck too damaged to read. Britain made cockpit voice recorders mandatory on every airliner on its register, directly because of Staines. The American authority mandated ground proximity warning systems across the fleet in 1974, with installation complete by the following May, and the same requirement went worldwide by the end of the decade. Manufacturers built recorders that held more parameters and survived harder impacts. Controllers got equipment that warns them when an aircraft is too low, which came out of the Everglades. One change from 1972 arrived without any equipment at all. When investigators looked at what 3 qualified pilots had been doing while their airliner descended into a swamp, they wrote something the industry had never written before, about how a cockpit crew divides its work and talks to itself. 3 weeks earlier, a different American crew had flown into a Chicago neighborhood while 2 of them worked on a broken recorder. The safety board examined those 2 accidents together, and the recommendation it produced became what every airline in the world now trains as crew resource management. 1972 produced 72 airliner crashes. In 2024, with roughly 40 million flights in the air, the figure was 7. What is left from that year is a set of files. Some are complete, with a cause and a mechanism, and a set of changes that followed. Some hold a page of possibilities, written by investigators who knew they were guessing and put that in the report. The crash on the mountain above Palermo is the one still producing evidence. In November 2025, 100 meters from a metal cross bearing 115 names, somebody walking that hillside found an aircraft toilet lying in the scrub. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura.